That night, the rain poured heavily, as if covering the world with a thick, impenetrable curtain. Irene, a young woman who had just arrived in the small town, hurried along, holding her umbrella tightly under the downpour. At the crossroads, she looked around, searching for a temporary shelter to escape the rain, but there was none. All she saw was a row of houses that looked nearly identical to one another. Strangely, the houses seemed quiet, with dim lighting that added to the eerie and unsettling feeling Irene had experienced since her arrival in the small town. She decided to continue walking straight until she finally spotted a 4-story building with a neon sign reading Motel on its wall. Irene felt a slight sense of relief when she saw the motel from a distance. However, when she finally reached it, she looked at the old building in front of her with mixed feelings. The motel looked more like an abandoned, run-down structure than a place that could at least offer a temporary stay. The walls were dull and cracked, covered with moss spreading like an unhealed wound. But with a limited budget and the heavy rain that seemed likely to continue until morning, the motel was Irene's only option. After gathering all her courage, Irene decided to go in, even though her hands trembled as she turned the knob and tried to push open the large wooden door in front of her. The door creaked loudly, as if crying out in pain, opening the way to a dark and empty hallway. As Irene stepped inside, she felt the damp, cold air, bringing the scent of wet earth mixed with the faint smell of old wood. The dim light from the ceiling flickered, casting shadows that moved erratically on the walls, which were covered with worn-out wallpaper. Irene quickly walked toward the reception desk and rang the bell sitting on the counter, as there was no one around. She rang the bell several times, intending to leave when no one showed up. Irene sighed in frustration, ready to go. But as she turned around, she was startled by the sudden appearance of an old woman who was now standing behind her. The old woman greeted Irene with a strangely friendly demeanor and introduced herself as Edna. Everything about Edna seemed odd to Irene, not just her overly friendly behavior. However, Irene chose not to think too much about it, as the night was getting late and she was too tired from her long journey. She took the room key that Edna offered her without asking any further questions. Knowing that her room was on the top floor, Irene quickly headed to the only staircase there, as the motel had no elevator. As she climbed the creaking stairs, each step echoed, as if the building absorbed her footsteps and sent them back with a deeper, more frightening tone. When Irene reached each floor, she felt something strange, like someone was watching her. She even took a moment to glance down the dimly lit hallways, but she saw no one there but herself. Only silence and the sound of rain softly weeping outside accompanied her steps. Her room was on the top floor, at the end of a narrow corridor lined with other doors, all tightly shut and wrapped in darkness. Irene quickly approached her door, eager to find refuge behind it. As the door opened, she was immediately greeted by a cold room with dim lighting. The room had little furniture, an old bed with gray sheets, a wooden table with a cracked mirror above it, and a large, heavy wardrobe. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but the air in the room felt heavy, almost as if something unseen was filling every corner. The first night at the motel felt long and exhausting. The rain outside had not stopped, drumming against the window in a monotonous rhythm. Irene tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she heard a faint sound. More precisely, a whisper, like someone speaking softly right in her ear, but the words were never clear. Just a weak sigh, which grew closer and closer. When Irene turned on the bedside lamp, there was nothing there, only darkness staring back at her from the corners of the room. But as she lay back down, the whisper returned, clearer this time, sounding as if it came from behind the wall. She approached the wall and pressed her ear against it cautiously. A sharp coldness spread from the wall into her body. From behind the wall, Irene heard the sound of crying, weak and muffled, as if it came from within the wall itself. She immediately panicked, stepped back, and looked around. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as the sound grew louder, turning into groans and muffled screams. Suddenly, the entire wall began to shake, and small cracks started to appear, spreading like spider webs across its surface. Terrified, Irene ran to the door, but when her hand touched the doorknob, she realized it was locked, as if the room would not let her leave. At the same moment, out of the corner of her eye, Irene saw something in the cracked mirror, a shadow, a vague shape moving behind her. Holding her breath, she gathered the courage to turn around, but there was nothing there. The mirror then began to fog up, as if something was breathing heavily behind its surface. Slowly, words began to form in the mist on the mirror. "Get out. Now." Seeing this, fear instantly took over her. Irene tried to pull the door with all her strength, but it remained locked while the walls around her shook more violently, and the cracks started to spew dust in small fragments. From within the walls, she could hear a steady knocking sound, like someone trying to get out. The knocking then turned into a loud pounding that made Irene's heart feel like it would burst out of her chest. Desperate, Irene pounded on the door, hoping to break it down so she could escape. At the same time, she saw the wall beside her start to crack and then collapse, revealing a large, dark, empty gap. From that gap, pale hands began crawling out, with long, thin fingers clawing at the air, trying to reach her. Then, broken and pitiful faces appeared from behind the gap, staring at her with empty eyes and mouths open in silent screams. Irene screamed in terror at the horrifying sight, but her voice was drowned out by the rumbling inside the wall. Something from within the gap began pulling her, trying to drag her into the darkness. With her last bit of strength, Irene tried turning the doorknob once more. This time, fortunately, the door opened with such force that it threw her out of the room. Irene ran down the stairs without looking back, while whispers, groans, and pounding noises still chased after her. When she reached the ground floor, she was shocked to find that the motel lobby had transformed into a large hall filled with paintings, statues, and ornaments related to a satanic cult. She tried to find an exit, but the hall seemed enchanted. Wherever she tried to run, she always ended up back in the center of the hall. Nearly in despair, Irene was drawn to a family portrait hanging on the wall and noticed that one of the women in the painting wore a cross necklace that looked exactly like hers. Irene began searching for clues about the woman in the painting, rummaging through the cabinets and shelves around her. After searching for a long time, she finally found an old journal with a worn cover and yellowed pages. As she opened the first page of the journal, Irene discovered that it was the diary of Lady Eleanor Fairfield, the woman in the painting who wore the same cross necklace as hers. In her diary, Lady Eleanor, who lived in the early 20th century, wrote about her life after marrying Lord Edwin Fairfield, a wealthy and eccentric nobleman. At that time, Lady Eleanor, who came from out of town, had no idea that the Fairfield family was a wealthy and highly respected family in the small town. However, the Fairfields were known not only for their wealth, but also for the mystery surrounding them. Rumors spread at the time that the Fairfield family was involved in occult practices and dark rituals. In her diary, Lady Eleanor confirmed these rumors and revealed that her husband, Lord Edwin, who was also the head of the family, was the leader of a satanic cult and gained dark powers from the rituals he frequently performed. Although Lord Edwin never forced her to join the cult, it didn't mean Lady Eleanor had the freedom to do what she wanted. In reality, Lord Edwin always kept her locked up in the house, severely restricting her movements. Each day, Lady Eleanor only interacted with Edna, her loyal servant. As Irene read about Edna, she suddenly felt a chill and remembered the old woman who greeted her in the motel lobby, also named Edna. Was it merely a coincidence, or... Irene didn't want to think too much about it. She quickly turned the page and read further about Lady Eleanor's life, hoping to find a way to escape from this house. But soon after that, instead of finding a clue, Irene felt the floor beneath her begin to shake, and the tremors grew stronger and stronger, causing objects around her to fall. At the same moment, the spirit of Lady Eleanor suddenly appeared in her most terrifying form and let out an ear-piercing scream. Irene did not understand why she was trapped in such a horrific situation. However, she knew one thing. She had to escape quickly, because the floor beneath her was starting to collapse, and the darkness below was waiting to swallow her. At that moment, Lady Eleanor's spirit suddenly possessed Irene's body, forcing her to feel the anguish, anger, and pain that Lady Eleanor experienced in her final moments. That night, during a heavy rainstorm with fierce winds, Lord Edwin began his ritual by worshipping the demon that had given him dark powers. The ritual required a human sacrifice, so Lord Edwin secretly performed it in the basement of his house. Meanwhile, Lady Eleanor, who was in her room, always felt fear and anxiety whenever her husband conducted these rituals, as it was essentially committing murder. Even so, Lady Eleanor did not have the courage to oppose her husband, because Lord Edwin often treated her harshly and constantly threatened to kill her and their children. The sound of the heavy rain hitting the roof and windows at least helped to muffle the screams of the victims used as sacrifices. But for some reason, Lady Eleanor continued to feel a bad premonition, as if a great tragedy was about to befall her family. Realizing that her husband's ritual was not going well, Lady Eleanor instructed Edna to take her children and leave the house before something terrible happened to their family. Lady Eleanor then gave her necklace to her baby girl, Alice, who was only 6 months old at the time, as the necklace was a charm believed to have protective powers. But unexpectedly, all the lights in the house suddenly went out and the atmosphere became silent, as if the house was holding its breath before unleashing a terror that would destroy everything. Knowing that the ritual had failed, Lady Eleanor quickly told Edna to take Alice and leave the house, while she tried to save her other children. At the same time, screams of pain echoed from the basement, and then everything became quiet and eerie. Inside the room, Lady Eleanor instructed her children to stay silent as they saw a dark shadow stop right outside their door. The tension grew as the doorknob slowly turned, and then suddenly the door burst open, as if someone had forcibly broken it down. At that moment, Lady Eleanor saw her husband standing in the doorway, still wearing the black robe he always wore during his rituals. Meanwhile, the children looked relieved to see their father and started to move toward him. However, Lady Eleanor quickly stopped them, realizing that the man before her was no longer the husband she had known. Seeing that her husband was holding a blood-stained axe, Lady Eleanor tried to bring Lord Edwin back to his senses, suspecting he was possessed by the evil entity he had worshipped during the ritual. But her words had no effect on Lord Edwin, whose mind was now controlled by that dark force. Lord Edwin then swung the axe, attempting to strike Lady Eleanor and their children. But Lady Eleanor quickly grabbed his arm, trying to protect her children. She told them to run while she used all her strength to fight her husband. Meanwhile, Lady Eleanor's children, George and Charlotte, tried to find a way out of the house, but it seemed as though the house itself had trapped them inside. As they reached the ground floor, they heard their mother's agonizing screams, but they didn't have the courage to turn back and help her. At the same time, they realized the dark shadow was chasing them again, so they rushed toward the front door. Just as they were about to reach it, the shadow caught them, pulling them into the darkness, leaving only their screams, which slowly faded away, swallowed by the dark. In the present, Irene suddenly felt weak as Lady Eleanor's spirit left her body. At that moment, Irene realized that the evil entity that had killed the Fairfield family still resided in the house and intended to kill her as well. She immediately ran toward the main entrance, but unexpectedly, the evil entity appeared in the form of Lord Edwin and tried to attack her. Irene fought back and attempted to escape, but Lord Edwin quickly grabbed her leg, intending to drag her into the darkness. Irene was on the verge of despair, struggling to resist the evil force. But surprisingly, the cross necklace she was wearing suddenly began to glow, so she decided to use it against the dark entity. Fortunately, Irene managed to free herself from Lord Edwin's grasp, and at that moment, the main entrance door suddenly swung open by itself, as if inviting her to leave immediately. Irene immediately ran outside, feeling the cold dawn air and the rain hitting her face. She kept running, away from the house, until she could no longer hear the strange noises and screams coming from inside. When Irene stopped and looked back, the building had disappeared, and all that remained was a dense forest that should not have been in the middle of the town. However, from within the forest, those voices still echoed, calling her name. Sometime later, as the sun rose, Irene finally saw the town as it truly was, something she hadn't sensed when she first arrived. It was as if she had entered another dimension last night, trapped there until she managed to escape. Irene then walked to the town library, searching for information about the Fairfield family, who might have once lived in the town. After examining old records, she discovered that the Fairfield family was one of the town's founders in the early 20th century. Because of this, the Fairfields were highly respected, not only for their wealth but also for their significant influence in the town. The records also mentioned rumors about Lord Edwin Fairfield being involved with a satanic cult and performing rituals in his house's basement, which reportedly included human sacrifices. The local residents claimed to have heard strange noises and screams from inside the house, but no one dared to approach or ask questions because they were too afraid of the powerful Fairfield family. Furthermore, the records detailed a horrific tragedy that befell the Fairfields, where all family members were found dead in their home under terrible conditions. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, as if they had seen something horrifying before they died. Their bodies were discovered locked within the walls and floors, as if they had been trying to escape but ended up trapped inside the house itself. After that incident, the Fairfield house was left empty for many years, and over time, the story of the Fairfields became an urban legend. Locals believed the house was cursed and that the spirits of the Fairfield family still haunted the place. Irene then turned to more recent records and found that, decades later, a businessman purchased the Fairfield property and renovated it into a motel. However, the motel business did not do well in the town, especially using a haunted building. Guests who stayed there only lasted a few hours before fleeing in panic and fear. They reported experiencing strange events, such as hearing whispers at night, seeing shadows moving on their own, and feeling an unseen presence around them. Over time, the motel's bad reputation led to the building being abandoned once more. It was eventually closed and left in ruins, despite attempts to demolish it. However, every time there was a plan to tear down the building, mysterious accidents occurred that delayed or canceled the plans. In the end, the building remained standing, a dark shadow in the corner of the town, luring unsuspecting people inside to become the next victims of the Fairfield curse. Now, the motel only appears to those whose fates are marked by darkness. Those who enter never come out unharmed, and the building continues to guard the cursed spirits trapped within, patiently waiting for the next victim. After reading the entire story about the Fairfield curse, which had become an urban legend, Irene felt grateful that she had managed to escape the haunted house safely. Irene then remembered her cross necklace, which was very similar to the one that belonged to Lady Eleanor Fairfield. The necklace was an inheritance from her late grandmother, and Irene recalled that her grandmother had once said it was a family heirloom. Remembering vividly the past of Lady Eleanor Fairfield when her spirit possessed her, Irene decided to find out more about Alice Fairfield, Lady Eleanor's youngest daughter, who was just 6 months old when the great tragedy struck her family. As Irene dug deeper into Alice Fairfield's past, she was shocked to discover that Alice Fairfield was her ancestor. Irene finally realized that she had managed to escape the haunted building not merely by chance, but as the result of a series of events that unknowingly connected her to the building's dark history. Unlike the previous victims, Irene possessed something they did not: a surprising connection to the Fairfield family. Unbeknownst to her, Irene was a distant descendant of Alice Fairfield, the only member of the Fairfield family to survive the curse. Edna, Lady Eleanor Fairfield's loyal servant, managed to get Alice out of the house safely before the terrible tragedy struck the family. Edna and Alice survived, thanks to the cross necklace given to Alice by her mother, Lady Eleanor Fairfield. The necklace was passed down from generation to generation as a family heirloom, with its true origin remaining unknown. Irene received the necklace from her grandmother when she was a child, and unknowingly, she had always carried it with her as a good luck charm. The necklace, which seemed harmless, actually contained protective power given by Lady Eleanor in her final attempt to protect her youngest daughter from the curse that had fallen on the Fairfield family. When Irene entered the motel, the spirits haunting the place recognized her as the last descendant of the Fairfield family, especially since she carried the cross necklace that had saved her ancestor. Initially, the spirits tried to drag her into the darkness, as they had done with previous victims, because they could not distinguish whether Irene was an enemy or an ally. However, when the necklace began to glow in her pocket, the protective power within it was triggered. The cursed spirits within the walls of the building finally recognized the necklace as a symbol of the promise given by Lady Eleanor to her youngest daughter. They realized that Irene was not a threat, but their only hope of escaping their endless cycle of suffering. Therefore, instead of harming her, the spirits helped Irene escape the building safely. They opened the locked doors and pushed her out, albeit roughly, so she could flee before the evil entity in the building could take full control. However, Irene's safety came at an unseen cost. When she managed to escape, the spirits temporarily lifted the curse from the building. In the end, the cursed building remained, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone else to enter. The cross necklace Irene carried began to lose its power as time passed. If the curse is not broken permanently, there is a great chance the cursed building will reappear, seeking new victims unaware of the danger inside. While Irene managed to survive, she carried the memories and trauma that she could never forget. She may have escaped alive, but she was not truly free from the horror that surrounded her. The cursed building, with its dark secrets, remains a threat, and only time will tell when it will return to claim new victims and drag them into its eternal darkness.